We live? All right, howdy anglers. Thanks for tuning in today. It's Dan Rice here with River Feet Fly Fishing. In this video, we're going to go through a step-by-step tutorial on building your first fly rod. So this video is mainly focused on those of you building your very first fly rod. So we're going to go through and demonstrate step-by-step the entire process, the entire operation. So the way I want you to use this video, I want you to use it playing along as you're got your components out, you're working on building your rod, you got it all set up, and you're going through step by step with us, sort of like we're in a classroom together. So play a little section of the video, pause it, catch up, do your wraps, do your epoxy, whatever step we're at, and then sort of resume and keep going along. Be prepared to, unless you're really just cranking out a fly rod on, you got a couple of consecutive days off, you're just cranking through it, or plan on having this process spread out over several days, even a week or two. Most of us that do this sort of thing, we have other full-time jobs and obligations that we're kind of focused on. So the rod we're actually building today, super stoked about. It's a high modulus carbon fiber two-piece rod blank. So that high modulus carbon fiber is just super responsive, super smooth. It's this type of rod blank you find on higher end rods that you pay $1,000 to $1,200 for if you were buying them from a reputable manufacturer. We also have the anodized reel seat with the burlwood insert. Found a really beautiful burlwood insert for this one. Went ahead and got some of these burl half-well cork grips. Just got a really nice texture, very unique, very soft feel to them. Super excited about these diamond polished zirconia stripping guides. I used them on a 7.6 3-weight that I built 5-6 years ago, and man, they just cast like freaking butter, guys. I mean, they just shoot so smooth. You're gonna love them if you ever try these guys. And this rod, it's actually a build for a client. It's going out to an outfit over in East Tennessee called Fly Life Fishing Guides. So if you aren't familiar with them, go ahead and check them out too. So yeah, on that note, as your first step to kind of get started, you got to find all your components, right? So where do you start? How do you start? I'll tell you a couple of places. And I usually, when I'm building a rod, it's very rarely that I get all the components from one source. It's more often I'm getting them from 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5. So with this one, I got a few of the components from mudhole.com, and then a handful of others from flycrafters.com, flyrodcrafters.com. Fly Shack hooked me up with a few of the parts. Custom Rod Builders set up some of the tools, equipment here that we use. So you take your time, make sure when you're ordering your components, you really want to be specific on making sure you have stuff that match up right. I'm not going to go into a whole tutorial on that because it's very in depth. You're going to have to, your best source there is to actually communicate directly with the retailers who are handling these types of components. So mudhole.com, I know they're always happy to get back to you on a live chat or an email if you have any questions about your stripping guides for the specific rod blank. The inside diameter of your insert reel, it fits the butt end of your 9-foot 7-weight rod blank, etc., etc. So take your time, get your components right. That's first and foremost fundamental stuff for building your own fly rod. So yeah, we're super stoked about this one. We're going to go through, like I said, step by step, the entire operation. Pause while you're watching, while you're building your own rod. If you have any questions along the way, like I said, go onto our website, hit that contact button, reach out. We aren't selling any parts or components or anything. We just want to help you build the best rod that you can, because there's something really special about having your own custom heirloom rod. Whether it's something you build for yourself to fish, whether you're building it as a gift for someone, or in this case, building it for clients. It's just super cool because you can customize it to look how you want it to look, cast how you want it to cast, and know that there's not another rod in the world that looks exactly like the one you're going to make today. So stay tuned after the video. We always cast test our rods before giving them out to a client. So that's sort of the fun part, right? Because there's a lot of patience throughout this whole process of building your fly rod. There's a lot of times when you're sitting there and literally watching the epoxy dry, and you want to just feel how smooth it is, but you know you can't. Don't touch that epoxy until it's fully cured. You're going to leave a fingerprint if you do. So be really patient, really deliberate, really steady. At the end of this video, we're going to go on down to the casting yard back by the river here at River Feet Ranch and throw some line, load test it before we send this off to the client and let them start fishing. So thanks for tuning in again. Remember, hit that like and follow button down there and reach out if you got any questions. Best fishing for you. Our reel seat insert comes sort of glazed, shiny. That's not going to take epoxy very well. So we're going to take our file, sand that off there and up there. So that epoxy sticks in there, and that epoxy goes to there. Just enough to rough it up, and then get rid of all the debris. Same thing up here. Making sure we aren't going past that point. We have plenty of space. That'll be enough for the epoxy to adhere to, though. Check all of our fittings. I always like to double check, make sure the reel actually fits in it. Pull this all apart. And we're going to create a little space for it to cure. That off, I'm filing it down. And we're going to take other pieces of tape here, tape off the rest of our reel seat insert so it does not receive any epoxy on that beautiful finish. Same with this end. Really want to make sure we're covering those threads. It'd be a bummer to get them filled in with epoxy. Wouldn't be the end of the world. You could file them out. It would just be a little extra work, and you'd risk scratching it up. Keeping it mostly focused on the bottom so it has room to push up as it's inserted. And there we go. towel ready to wipe off some of that excess immediately. The up lock, the stationary up lock. So we want to see where our lines are. We're going to start 180 degrees off and turn it as it goes in so it'll smear it all around. Make sure we've got it lined up so that the reel seat can go in there. Up there. I'll let this just sit here and dry right on our tape. Alright, so next, this is still curing, so we're going to keep an eye on that. Next, we need to fit our fighting butt onto here, which is a little snug out of the package, so we need to loosen up that gap. There's a few ways we could do this. We could use a drill press, which we might end up doing. I'm going to try with the file here for a minute and see how it does. Okay. So now super fine file for this. So now we're going to do a false assembly just to get an idea where everything lines up. Yeah, cork doesn't fit all the way, so that's going to need to be reamed out a bit. So where we left off, we need to ream out the center of our cork handle until it fits and slides all the way down our rod blank. So I just have a wrap file here I'm going to start using, and I'm actually going to try to save as much of the cork as I can that comes out, because what you can do with these little cork shavings, you can seat's going to look like. So we are back. We had false assembled the butt end of our rod, winding check, cork handle, reel seat, fighting butt. Now we're going to start the assembly. We're going to use our Pro Coat for the reel seat because there's a little bit more gap in there. This Pro Coat really helps fill gap. And we're going to use our Gorilla Glue clear 5-minute epoxy fighting butt, cork handle, winding check. But first we want to kind of sand off some of the covering on the rod blank itself to help all those bonding agents adhere. Alright, so now that we have false fitted all of the components that make up the butt end of our rod, we've got our Pro Coat paste prepped for the reel seat. We're going to mix up some of this 5-minute epoxy for the cork components, as well as the winding check. Take a brush and brush some of this right on down here. Just a little bit on the inside. And twist it as it goes up. Push that down nice and straight. We have our mark where the front of the reel seat goes, so we're going to put our paste all the way up to that point. And kind of working, and we're going to kind of turn this down as it goes. Bit. Move the insert, and we're going to start heavy on the top again. Slime our way down. Epoxy. It's already starting to harden. All right, let's double check that a reel actually fits in there still. Now we leave it here to cure overnight. We'll be back tomorrow. All right, so once we are ready to start wrapping guides onto our rod blank, the very first step is we need to find the spine of the blank. Two-piece rod sections, clearly you only have to do that on 2 parts. 4-piece, 6-piece, etc. You've got more spines to determine, and they can be trickier too with shorter pieces, because with shorter pieces each one's only going to flex a little bit, and it's harder to interpret that exact spine location, whereas long ones you've got a lot of bend, got a lot of responsiveness, and you really feel where that spine kicks. So just a little brief intro into what we're talking about when we say a rod blank spine. Imagine this material as it's being manufactured, it's rolled together on sort of a spindle, and at one point, one section, it overlaps, and that's how it's pressed and sealed together, and that is going to have the least flex out of the rest of the rod, right? Because it's 2 pieces overlapping in a small section. Most rod builders will say the best place for the spine is the back of the rod. So it kind of holds that backbone through as you're casting, and it also gives you a little bit more backbone when you're fighting that big fish. But part of being a rod builder is being creative, so if you feel like your casting technique should shift that spine to the front or even to the outside or inside of your rod hand, experiment, see what works. For this demonstration, we're keeping the spine on the back of the rod. So to find the spine, you're going to hold it loosely in your right hand if you're right-handed. Do this in reverse if you're left-handed. Loosely in the right hand so that it can turn like so. We want just the tip of the rod pressed down on a long, sturdy, flat surface. And somewhere around the middle of the blank, you're going to take your left hand and just sort of roll it. And you can feel where the rod wants to jump. You press down, give it some pressure, not too much, but just enough to put some bend in that rod, and just roll it. And you'll feel that place where it jumps. It wants to skip on you. Right there is where the spine must run. So I'm going to reset, try again, see if I find the same place. I suggest doing it a few times just to make sure your senses aren't deceiving you. So I'm getting it right there. I'm going to take my white China marker and just give a little mark indicating where I found the spine. I'm going to do it again without looking at that mark, just feeling, and see if I feel it in the same place. Right there. Yep, and that lined up, so I can be confident that this is in fact the spine of the rod. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to take, and I'm just going to place some marks periodically across this spine, so that as we're going through and wrapping guides, we want our guides to be exactly 90 degrees, rather 180 degrees, perfectly inverted on the other side of the rod blank from the spine. So what I'm actually going to do is have this rod perfectly vertical, so the spine is perfectly on top. I'm going to mark a point on the end, right on the top center, where I can see it. Then I'm going to flip it over so I can see that mark I put on the butt end of this blank. And I'm going to have that perfectly centered on the bottom. And what I'm actually going to do then is I'm going to mark the side of the blank where the rod guides will be placed. And we just want to go along periodically drawing a line. Just do it about every 6 to 8 inches is good, just so I can have a clear visual of where those rod guides are going to be placed. And just while I'm doing this, make a little note, if you are, I like a 2-piece rod for casting. Think about it with 4-piece, 6-piece, those are nice for travel, packing, a lot of other efficient benefits. But when it comes to actual casting, let's scrape off these back ones quick first so we don't get those mixed up with thinking that's actually the belly of the rod where the guides will go. We want those completely removed. Later on, when we're done, it's very easy to scrape this China marker off with our burnishing tool. So yeah, what I was saying about rod blanks, a 2-piece rod is going to cast the best. Every time you put ferrules together, when you have one blank going into another blank, so that's going to be about 2 inches of overlap. You lose some transition of power, you lose flex every time there's a ferrule added to a blank. So it's pretty minuscule as far as how it actually impacts your casting. You won't notice it unless you're really looking for it. But if you're looking for a rod that will cast the smoothest, 2-piece, 1-piece ideally, the fewer the pieces, the better the casting power, the better the transition of energy from your hand to the tip of the rod. So I went with the 2-piece on this one. So each section, long sections, easy to find the spine. I had already marked the spine on the butt section, because then the spine is the opposite of what we call the belly of the rod. The belly of the rod is the side that gets the guides. The guides will be in line perfectly with where the reel seats. So when you have your reel on, you have a perfect line down the rod of the belly of the rod. If you're working with a 4-piece or a 6-piece, you're going to have real short butt sections. You don't even need to find the spine on your first butt section. Your second one, maybe, depending on what weight rod you're using, it's less important than it is on your higher up sections of your rod blank. So we have the belly of the tip blank marked. I'm going to go ahead and mark the belly of my butt section of the blank. And actually, this is easier done if you have a reel mounted. You get a little bit better visual line. Now, we've got both blanks prepped for guides. I'm going to start on the butt end. We're going to get our rod wrapping tool set up, get our threads loaded, pause the video, come back when we're ready to rock. Alright, so what we're going to do for our next step, you'll see I have the rod blank laid out on my working surface. It's important you have a fairly long, very sturdy, smooth, flat surface when you're building your rods, and also good lighting. We have our rod blank taped down on our surface just with some masking tape on each end with our belly lines facing upwards towards us. That's where the guides will go. You're going to need a tape measure is our next tool here. I really like a long, skinny cloth tape measure. It's flexible, it moves, it holds the form of the rod very nicely. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take just some small strips of masking tape and tape it securely on the tip top, pull it tight all the way to the butt of the rod, tape it again so it runs along the contour of this tapered rod blank. And then after that, we'll go through and use our guide chart to mark the location of where each of the snake guides and casting guides will be located. So, here we go. Got that taped up. It's only a 60-inch long cloth tape, which is okay. We can get the first sections marked, and then we can just measure from there for probably the 2 stripping guides will be below here. So we're going to get our rod spacing chart out, place all our markings. We're not going to get into guide spacing theory today because that's kind of its whole own other separate beast. Just know when you're starting out building rods, or even if you just want consistency in building rods, it's best practice to use the rod blank manufacturer's guide spacing chart recommendations. And they should have those for their model of the rod and size, weight, and number of pieces for each specific rod blank. As you get down the road, you can get a little creative with how you space your guides to make that blank perform in different ways suitable for your own custom casting technique. For today, we're using the rod manufacturer's suggested guide spacing chart. Alright, so here I have transcribed the 10 measurements for our 10 guides. I'm going to mark those along the belly of the rod blank. When I marked that belly, I went in line with the length of the rod. To be able to distinguish my guide marks, I'm going to go crossways from in line with the rod. So I'm going to come across, and that's going to mark the center of each guide. I have repositioned my cloth tape, marking the last hash as the new 0. So that was this one right there. Make sure you double check if you're doing this system. I've got 8 marks. So that means I'm at 66 and 7/16. So I just need to do a little math. 67 7/16 minus 54 11/16. So that is a -4/16 on the fraction side and 13 on the whole. So 13 minus 4/16 is 12 12/16. So now I just go from my 0 point and mark 12 12/16. Which is the same thing as 3/4. Alright. Then for our next mark, take my highest last number, 79 5/16 minus the position holding our 0, which was 54 11/16. So 5 is less than 11, so we're at -6/16 on the fraction side. 79 minus 54 is 15. No, 25. 25, damn. 25 minus 6/16 is 24 10/16, which is also the same as 5/8. So for my 0 mark, I'm going to go down 24 5/8. Okay. Okay, so now that we have all of our guide spacings marked, we're going to remove the tape. And I'm just going to lay all my guides out next to the hash marks just to confirm I've got the right size guides, right number of guides, and start to kind of visualize it as I'm preparing to begin wrapping thread. Alright, now we're going to get that cloth tape off the rod, set up our thread wrapping stand, prep the area, and we'll be right back to start with affixing the hook check. So we're going to start from the butt end and work our way up. Let's review some of the tools we have here. Again, we have our rod stand. You should have rubber bands on at least one end, usually the opposite end that the rod's point is facing towards. That prevents it from kind of jiggling up. If you lose your rubber band, dig around in your wife's cabinet, and I think I found this hairband there. All right, we have 2 different widths of masking tape. These are going to be used when we tape our guides into place on the rod blank to help secure them. We have a short piece of 2/0 non-waxed Kevlar thread. You can use your rod thread. You want to use something that's going to be pretty tough, unwaxed, and we're going to use this when we get around to finishing our thread wraps. You use it for your finishing knot, which we'll see here shortly. I like to have that prepped and ready. A few tools out of the tying vise that come in handy, your hackle pliers, tying scissors, sharp pair, like a curved hemostat, and then we have our burnishing tool and pick. And we're going to start by taking our hook keep and now a couple notes on a hook keep. Sometimes you can, some people like to do this, when you're mounting your handle and your winding check, you can actually put the first end of that tucked down into the winding check and tuck it back. That saves you from wrapping thread on two ends. Some people like that look, some people like the efficiency of it. This one I wanted to have it spaced out a little further away from the rod handle, so we're going to elect to just mount it right about there, making sure, you know, we're visualizing that we have enough space for our thread, and I want to have a little bit of space where you're actually seeing that rod blank before it goes straight to thread. This rod we're going to go with a two-tone thread wrap. I've got sort of a light olive as our main binding wrap. That's what the wrap that's going to be used for actually holding the guides in place. And then for a decorative trim, we have sort of a rosy gold metallic. The tensile strength on this stuff is much less than our size A nylon guide wrap. So the decorative wrap, it's okay. You're not really holding any resistance with it. So, first step, get a little piece of this super thin 1/4 inch masking tape. Fix it to the opposite end of the hook keep. I'm going to start, I always start from the butt end working up. So that means I'll wrap my butt end thread first, then I'll wrap my tip top end second. And that'll be true for all the guides. So I'm going to hold this perfectly in line with our belly marking, just visualizing how much thread I want, how much blank I want. Tape that snugly into place. Take a look at it, make sure those feet are both in line with the belly of the blank. All right. Gonna test the tension on this. Feels pretty good. All right, so let's get our thread all prepared. Come up through our tensioning rod, through that middle hook, and then down through our spacing bar. This is a little slide bar, so you can kind of adjust where you want that placed in relation to the guides. You want it in line with where you're starting your thread. And you don't have to worry too much about the exact location of your first few wraps, because that can be adjusted once you have it secured. So we're going to pinch it tight, bring the thread fully around, up and over, around, pinch it tight, and then if you're a fly tyer, you understand this concept of bringing the thread back over itself. So we're just going to give it one good spin in its current location. Loosen up that tension a little bit. And then we're going to start to bring that thread back over itself. You want to get it back over itself at least 3, if not 4 times before you let it go, just to make sure it's holding tight. Good to release. I'm going to do a couple more before I straighten up those wraps. secured. I'm going to tighten these up with my burnishing tool, just spinning the rod and creating a straight line. Just using that sort of angled edge side of the burnishing tool, create my nice tight straight line while continuing to wrap forward. That's secure. Now we take our flat edge and without nicking the blank or cutting your thread wraps, pinch that off. Doesn't have to be super tight because that's going to get covered anyway. And we'll continue wrapping by hand. I like to do every 3 or 4 wraps and then go back with the burnishing tool to tighten them up. And you'll see, hopefully you can see on there, how close we're getting to the first foot of our hook keep. We want to loosen up that tension a little bit for the first couple wraps around the footing. Tighten them up really quick. Get that first wrap. Pull up and over around the footing a little bit. You don't want to go under it. If you go under, you're going to be kind of regretting it later. A little less tension here. Going to get 3 or 4 good wraps over that foot. Again, observing that, the pressure of that thread hasn't shifted the direction of our guide, or in this case, hook check, hook keep. So there's 3 over the foot. I'm going to do 1 more over the foot. And then we can use our burnishing tool, start from the butt end, just work that up nice and snug. And then I'm going to use my tip of it here, just kind of push those feet down nice and snug. Push those threads down right where they're covering the tip of the foot. And then continue to work them tight. This is where you can get in trouble if you don't take your time and do it right. Once you start wrapping that feet, it kind of wants to create a little bit of an angle in how the thread wraps. So you want to make sure you're taking your time, working those wraps nice and snug to each other, keeping a straight line. And when you're doing it right, when you're keeping those tight, you'll notice that the thread just sort of naturally lays down next to itself. once you get to where you have between enough space on your foot for 4 to 6 more wraps, this, my friends, is where we want to hide our knot. I like to hide my knot right about a 45-degree angle from the guide I am working on. So what that means is we're going to loosen up our tension just a touch. We're going to create a loop in our spare piece of thread that we have. You just want enough loop to where you'll be able to bring this tag end after you cut it through there to cinch your knot down. So we're going to set that underneath our thread, like so. Get it under one wrap, enough of a loop that we'll be able to pull it through after. And then we're just going to continue wrapping up and over that. There's 2. You want to get at least 4, no more than 6 is ever necessary. Any more than that, actually it gets really hard to pull your thread through. There's 5. And 1 more. Okay. Now, you got to be careful with this step because there's a lot of tension here. You don't want to cut it and let it shoot out. So what we're going to do, we're going to hold pressure there. We're going to make sure we have our straight edge at the ready. We're going to hold pressure there, release tension off of this, cut it, and then pull the tag end from the cut through that loop, hold it snug, pull the loop out to secure our knot. So try to keep this turned towards you as much as I can while still being able to see what I need to do. Hold our threads nice and snug, reduce tension. You want the tension fully reduced, otherwise that thread is just going to shoot right out of there. So wait until you get slack in the line, and then give yourself a good 2 or 3 inches to work with here. And run it through your loop. Nice and snug. Hold your pressure with one finger. And pull that through with the other. All the way through. Snug it down. Don't cut it yet. You want to burnish it. Make sure it's nice and packed nice and tightly. Straight lines. Nice and snug. Alright. Now be careful with this cut. You don't want to nick any of your threads, but you want to get it close so that it doesn't kind of boil up at the end. When you put your epoxy on, if there's any little loose threads, it'll create a little boil in the epoxy and that clear coat. So we're going to lay it flat. Just drag that thread across the blade. There we go. Give it another good burnishing. Pack it nice and tight. secure. We're going to do the same thing on the other end. So now we won't need any masking tape because that first batch of wraps will hold it. Sometimes that pressure of the wraps wants to kick it out a little bit, so be ready to straighten it out as needed. And there we go. Hook keeper loaded. Let's do the next one. As mentioned earlier, we're going to do all of our olive secure wraps for the footers first, and then we're going to come back and do our decorative wraps. That way you don't have to restring the line in between each guide. All right, that one's complete. We're going to use that same essential procedure for our stripping guides and then the snake guides. Start with a fresh section of our knotting thread here. Pulling it through that tension. I just like to start with a fresh one with every guide. And before I get it ready, I just like to center it and just check that those feet lay nice and flat. Sometimes you need to manipulate them a little bit to get them to lay nice and flat. You don't want any gap in there. Any gap over time is going to start to loosen the threads and crack the epoxy. So you want those feet to be nice and snug. This one we need to manipulate just a touch. A pair of snub nose channel lock pliers. I'm going to grip it in a place that's going to be covered by the thread, so if it gets a little dinged up from the pliers, don't worry about it. We're just going to bend it ever so gently the direction we need it. Alright, centered up, no more gap, and a good 45-degree angle rod blank guide. You don't want that guide to be skewed. You want it to be perfectly perpendicular from the rod blank. Shape that down nice and snug. Check the line up. This one will determine how accurate the rest of our guides are going to be. So the biggest stripping guide is the easiest one for wrapping because it's very rigid feet, and it's also on a minimally flexible section of rod blank. but it's maybe the most important because it will determine where that line for the rest of your guide is going to go. Okay, if you ever need to step away, that's where these hemostats come in nice and handy. You can simply pinch that line together right there, prevent it from unwinding, give yourself a little bit of slack. So when you're using your fly tying thread for your knot loop, you create that loop, and the loop always faces the opposite direction from where you started your thread. So when we're working up, it faces up. When we're working down, it faces down. And we're going to sneak that thing in right here. Release our hemostats. Wrap over that. That should be still nice and straight between our belly marks and the feet. Now we are going to apply our decorative thread trim here. Now let's see, a few things to note on this. With your decorative rod trim, we're going to start just a little bit gap between our foot wraps, and we're going to actually work away from them. If you're doing decorative trim, you need to be confident in your ability for both binding the thread to begin your wraps and in your knots after, because you're not going to have much space to cover mistakes. So, without further ado, we're going to begin. Get some tension on there. Remember, we don't have to be tight to our foot wraps right away because we can burnish those down where we need them. We just want to be close at this point. Give it a few wraps by hand. Okay. Now we have a little base. A little more tension. Start pulling over our tag end. Enough times to hold it tight. Enough to pinch it on there. So we can release and hold. And give it one more wrap over the tag end. And I'm going to burnish it tight. Jam it right up into those footer wraps. Nice and snug. All right. Then we need our knot thread ready. And set that right away. And since there's not going to be any pressure on this knot, you can get away with 3 or 4 wraps. Typically, decorative wraps are pretty skinny. Makes them look a little more elegant. 1. And notice how I didn't cut this tag end off? That's intentional. Until 2, until I get a couple of threads on that knot. Now, cut that nice and snug down. Burnish snug. Three. Don't want it too tight yet because we've still got to be able to pull that knot through. We're going to do a 4th one. Four. All right. Now, going
Get our knot loop nice and ready. Loosen our tension. Slick it. Cut it. Okay, cut left hand with these scissors. Pull our knot. Right through itself. Now we are going to begin wrapping our threads on the tip top section of this two-piece rod blank. So you'll see here we're going to start with the female receiver end of the ferrule. And in order to kind of get that into place where I can tie it without it being awkwardly positioned, I just insert it into the male end of the butt section, lining up my belly marks. You don't want to push it fully snug. You want it to be a little loose, not so loose that it's going to spin when you start wrapping your threads, but loose enough so if those threads put a whole bunch of tension, it doesn't bind these two pieces together. So you want it, and you might have to play around, start looser than you think you might need. If you start wrapping your threads and it's spinning, you can always push it a little snugger. So I'm going to have my belly marks perfectly lined up. And remove my decorative thread from the butt section. Set that aside. Get my guide thread locked and loaded. And let's talk a little bit about putting guides right on a ferrule. In theory, it should not matter. But what some concerns are is that having that extra tension right on a joint can potentially cause splintering, shifting of your thread wraps that could slide off the butt end of the female receiver part. So rather, you can see where my mark is centered. So if I went exactly with the manufacturer's recommendations, this snake guide would carry over. I'm gonna slide it up. We're gonna be a ½ inch different than manufacturer guide recommendations, but that's gonna be just fine. Just fine. So I'm going to slide that up, and I'm going to imagine how much thread I'm going to overhang with my thread wraps and how wide that decorative trim piece is going to be. And I'm actually going to try to align that to where there's going to be hardly any rod blank after the decorative thread wraps, because we're going to coat all that with our clear coat finishing epoxy. Now, even if, say, the way your guide's lined up, where it was way up here, you're still going to want to put some thread wraps, at least a ½ inch, maybe up to an inch, on any female receiver end of your rod blank. That will just help reduce potential for splintering. So you'll always want to wrap your female ferrule ends of the rod blank. We are down to our final 4 snake guides. First of the 2 in a number 3 size, and then we have 2 number 2 sizes. This is where it starts to get a little trickier when you have a very narrow diameter of rod to work with. You got to be extra careful about getting those lined up perfectly, making sure your wraps are snug, and checking the feet on your snake guides themselves. So I'm going to start out here centering that guide with my China marker, and I put little hash marks on each side of the feet to mark my center, and bam. Then I'm going to check how well they lay. They both lay flat. I do feel a little bit of a rough edge on this foot though, where something in the machining process didn't quite, it just cut it funny there. So I'm going to get my file, I'm going to file that down. And I'm just going to use my extra fine file pick here. Just shouldn't take much. There it goes. All right, anglers, we are on the final snake guide. Very, very skinniest of them all. Getting where the rod blank diameter is barely as wide as the foot on the snake guide. This is when it gets real fun. You'll notice I added my extra V-notch stand in here to be able to have something to get tension on that. Otherwise, if it's way over there, it's doable, but then you're working way off to the side. And I like to work a little closer to the middle as much as possible. And we're going to do this the same way as before. Little less tension than our earlier guides though. And we're just going to do the butt facing foot with the traditional method that we've been doing, and then I'll show you a different technique for the tip top facing foot. The space we have to work with here is too narrow to be able to have your tip top resting on one end, but also it applies too much pressure on this really flexible tip top to get good consistent wraps. So use your bobbin, your fly tying bobbin. Make sure you got good tension on it so you can just kind of tighten your bobbin up there. And so we'll start this thread the same way you start thread on a hook if you were tying a fly. That up nice and close so it's equidistant as the previous butt facing section of this guide wrap. Take them down again. Slide this tip and just kind of turn it as you go. This through, a little trick to make it nice and straight. 5 minutes or so and come back and put our thread wraps on. Good tight wraps. And you don't have to go very far down. I'd say 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch is going to be plenty. Two options here Option one, if you're a fly tyer, you know the whip finishing knot. That's simple to do, and it's honestly the same exact knot that we perform when we use our little thread loop. All you're doing is you're wrapping the thread over itself and pulling it back under. So I'm just going to go ahead and whip finish. Pull that snug. We're going to burnish it nice and tight up to those footer wraps. Slow and easy does it, ladies and gentlemen. And definitely have, I like toilet tissue because it's super soft and absorptive. This is not an advertisement for Charms, but it works great to just kind of hold a straight line along that outer edge. Just pick up if you make the line a little too wide.
All right, howdy anglers. As promised, we are here down at the casting yard next to the river at River Feet Ranch. We've got the rod all finished. Hopefully you made it through with little to no minor hiccups. Either way, congrats to you for getting through the process, making it through all the way to the end here. It's no easy feat to build your first fly rod, so take a moment and just reflect on how super cool that is that you've done it, and I hope that it leads to a passion for building your own rods, building rods for friends, family, maybe even clients someday. It's a fun art, it's a craft, and you can just do some super cool stuff, you know. I mean, we meet some great people through the world and network of fly fishing, so building your own rod, it's a conversation piece, it's an heirloom item, and I hope you loved it. I hope you get out there, get a chance to use it. And so we'll just talk through a few of the things I like to test after the epoxy is fully cured. You know, make sure you want that epoxy to cure for a good 30 hours before you put any load on it. You know, after 24, you might be able to kind of start touching it, feeling how smooth it is and how pretty it looks and all that, right? But give it a good 30 hours to fully set and cure before you put any weight on that. That patience part's key through the entire process. And then as we're going to go through and test this rod, the first thing I'm checking, get that reel mounted. Should have already tested that the reel fits on your reel seat, locks right and everything. But at this point, what I want to do is I want to actually flip that rod upside down. I've got my two pieces assembled here, and we want to flip that rod upside down and just look down the length of it, right through the center of the rod, right over the center of the reel, all the way down the rod, and check that our guides are lined up. These ones are really nice and straight. If it's your first rod and you notice a couple of them are skewed just a little bit, don't sweat it. I mean, it's still going to cast fine if they're like a 10-degree angle different than the guide in front of it or behind it. You probably won't even notice it while you're casting. If it's more than like that 10-degree angle, you might want to consider cutting them off and reapplying them at that point. or just chalking it up to the mistake of the first rod. But again, with your first rod, don't sweat it if there's one that's just slightly skewed. But hopefully you took your time, had steady fingers, were super patient, and you got a good line of sight down your guides. For matching up the rod blanks, trick that I found I really enjoy is using 2 small flat adhesive bug eyes, and then just really light coat of epoxy finish over those, so they're hardly even noticeable, super smooth transition for line to flow right over. There's a lot of other things you can do to mark the lineup of your rod blanks, or you can elect to not line them up at all. I really encourage you to do some kind of lineup. That just saves you so much guesswork and time whenever you're going out to assemble your rod, right? So, I mean, another common one is using a paint tip marker. If you're just building the rod for yourself, maybe that's okay for you. Maybe you've got smoother fingers than myself, but every time I've tried using those paint tip markers, I can never get a perfect circle that I'm happy with. So I've elected to use just a nice rounded flat bug eyes. Decal, if you're into branding your rod, this can be a fun thing to do. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it on the screen there, but we just brand ours with the River Feet logo, and then underneath the rod length and weight. I've always used an outfit called Decal Connection. They've done really good for me. Make good decals, super easy to use, super clean. So when we're casting this rod, just start with some real short, basic pick up and put down casts, just to kind of get a feel for it. Make sure your sections are nice and snug together. And we're just going to start with some real basic pick up and put down, get a feel, make sure everything's smooth and transitioning right. And then we'll get up and we'll just start throwing some line, have some fun with it. So here we go. Ooh, that is smooth. All right. Let's shoot a little bit. See if we can't catch one of those elusive grass fish. You know, in high water, when the river comes up over that bank and it gets up to about there, and this stuff's kind of slow and more manageable, we'll catch fish right here on the yard. Let's see how she shoots. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Wow, it's a great thing from the first line with the newly crafted rod. Oh yeah. Oh boy. Oh boy. Nice. Oh boy. This one's gonna have some good fishing in its lifetime, I tell you. Like I said, if you have any questions at all about the rod building process while you're doing it, just get over on our website, hit that contact button, reach out. We're happy to help you. We want you to have a good time out there on the water. I'm quite pleased with that. Well, anglers, whew, I had a blast casting this thing. Yeah, super smooth, and I'll tell you, that was just just so easy, just throwing line. Nothing fell short, no recoil, none of that line kind of dropping in on itself that you get when the rod can't carry the weight of a long cast, but yet super smooth, easy pickup, whether it was with 20 feet of line or 60 feet of line. Just to give you an idea here, we're throwing 75 feet of line there at the end. There were just a couple of turns left on the fly line on the reel, and it was just shooting it super easy. So yeah, boy, I want to take this thing fishing, but I'll tell you one thing I never do is I never take a client's rod fishing, because that first fish belongs to them. So thanks for tuning in again. I hope you had a blast building your rod. Hope this video helped, and we'll see you downstream, eh?